What else is on?
Yeah, let's see what else is.
Would you walk around naked with 17 million people watching, including your friends and family? Get locked away for 15 months and have zero contact with the outside world, and have to choose between starvation and eating dog food? Your answer is probably no, and the producers of the disturbing Japanese TV show we'll be focusing on knew this. In 1998, a man named Nasubi, an aspiring comedian, was invited to participate in what he thought was a harmless TV program. But what he thought would be his big break soon turned into his worst nightmare. How did the authorities let what would eventually be seen as borderline torture happen? Why did the audience keep watching? This is the story of the most deranged spectacle that has ever aired on television, the real-life Truman Show. Born in the Japanese city of Fukushima, Tomoaki Hamatsu was the mild-mannered son of a policeman, a stay-at-home mom, and had an older sister. Due to the nature of his father's work, the family had to relocate frequently, and due in part to this constant moving, the young Hamatsu never managed to connect with his peers. As a kid, he was bullied quite a lot. With no solid friend group to turn to, the only way Hamatsu could connect was by embracing the jokes aimed at him. Most popular among these was Nasubi, or eggplant, a name that made fun of Hamatsu's long face. Instead of letting it bring him down, he chose to embrace it. By owning the name Nasubi, he developed a sort of alter ego. In many ways, the Nasubi name primarily served as a way to protect him from bullies. He realized that if he could make people laugh, they were less likely to hurl abuse his way. With his newfound moniker of Nasubi, the young man from Fukushima began to develop a love for comedy, leading into the clumsy, clown-like style that made kids laugh. Interestingly, that slapstick sort of humor is reminiscent of Jim Carrey, who played Truman Burbank in 1998's The Truman Show. Ultimately, being a local entertainer wasn't going to cut it if Nasubi intended to make a living. Against the approval of his family, he set his sights on the big city. He decided Tokyo was going to be the beginning of his career in comedy. While his parents weren't huge fans of the decision, they gave him their blessings on one condition. Talk about foreshadowing. In Tokyo, we start to witness the influence of Nasubi's childhood take shape. During his early years, much of his behavior was anchored by a profound need for acceptance. He's what most would describe as a people pleaser. It's plausible that these experiences cultivated a strong sense of subservience, making him an easy target for the producers, as you'd see later on. As a small-time comedian in the big city, Nasubi honed his craft at local comedy clubs. Most of his attempts at stardom were unsuccessful, yet he remained resilient. By chance, he managed to score a television audition that would change his life forever. It's important to highlight that this level of dedication can have its rewards. Yet, as we'll eventually come to see with Nasubi's quest for recognition and acceptance, this might be the mother of all monkey's paws. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of today's video, BetterHelp. The scariest thing about the story of Nasubi isn't what he went through during the show, but afterwards. Imagine how traumatizing it must have been for him when he realized that everyone he knows has been watching his every waking moment for the last 15 months. You might not have gone through the same experience of Nasubi, but if you're struggling with embarrassing or traumatic moments in your life, I can't recommend therapy enough. There was a time when I really struggled with imposter syndrome, and spending time with my therapist allowed me to fully understand why I was feeling that way and how I could overcome it. I'm now in a much better place mentally and more confident in my abilities. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy accessible and affordable to everyone. All you need to do is answer a few questions, and usually in as little as a couple of days, you'll be assigned to a professional therapist. Don't like the therapist you're assigned to? Well, you can easily switch to a new one completely for free, so you can make sure you have the best connection possible with your therapist. It's super important to feel comfortable with your therapist, and you can make sure you're extra comfortable by having your sessions through phone call, video chat, or messaging. Really, whatever feels best for you. With BetterHelp, getting started with therapy is now super easy. Just click the link in the description down below and go to betterhelp.com/aperture, or choose Aperture to get 10% off your first month and connect with the right therapist for you. Back to our story. In the 90s, Japan was buzzing with dozens of reality TV shows. Many of them were game shows, and in typical Japanese fashion, There were zany programs that had audiences in a frenzy. Among them, Susunu Denpa Shoden stood out as something even weirder than usual. The show displayed a darker side of entertainment, and its premise involved pushing participants to their limits for the amusement of viewers. Enter Toshio Tsuchiya, the creator and producer of the Denpa Shonen. Tsuchiya is what most would describe as intense. He's the sort of figure who lets a project consume every part of his being, and in the Japanese entertainment industry, that means success. Denpa Shonen was a huge hit, and he was involved in every single step of the creative process. Unlike other producers of reality TV, Tsuchiya never really set out to find a star, rejecting the idea of celebrities, instead stating, "All humans are entertaining." As a producer, he saw it as his duty to invoke the inner entertainer in the people he featured on his show. This mindset is what made him focus primarily on people who were willing to do anything to succeed. At the top of his list, comedians looking for their big break. That's exactly why Nasubi was on his radar in the first place. An interesting overlap exists in Tsuchiya's and Nasubi's backgrounds. Just like Nasubi, Tsuchiya is also the son of a police officer and he moved around a lot. Unlike Nasubi though, this lack of a strong connection did not compel him to make friends. Instead, it seems like it made him more of a quiet observer. The sort of person who watches others, studies them, and learns their motivations. Perhaps it was this keen eye for behavior that made him such a successful producer. At the time, TV was the ideal break from the stress of reality. In the late 90s, Japan's economy was on a decline. This meant that most people had to live through debt, failing businesses, and housing issues. For the regular folk, reality TV felt like the ideal break from the very real dramas they were dealing with in their own lives. Especially with shows like Denpa Shonen. It's that sort of thing where you're glad your life doesn't suck as much as the people on TV. Powered by Denpa Shonen's somewhat misleading editing, the depressing parts of the program weren't really highlighted. Instead, it's centered on the hilarious moments of struggle and incompetence from its contestants. It's interesting to imagine if people would have cared more if times were a little more, how should I say, blissful. As Tsuchiya saw more and more success with his ideas, he began to conceptualize his next big project. For this endeavor, he'd be taking things a step further than anyone had ever dared to, into truly uncharted territory. He wanted to silence the critics who saw Denpa Shonen as a hyped-up travel show. At the core of his being, Tsuchiya aimed to reveal to the world that anyone could be interesting. And that's how A Life in Prizes came to be. The concept for this program was special right from the start. Instead of a conventional recruitment process, the audition involved gathering 19 young comedians into a room for a quick game. The rules were simple. A mysterious box is placed in the center and each participant has to pull a piece of paper from it. A straightforward game of luck. This was presented live on Denpa Shonen, so viewers got a taste of some of the behind-the-scenes action. Each young hopeful pulled out a paper from the lottery box and unveiled the results. Nasubi was the lucky winner. Finally, it felt like Nasubi's dreams were within reach. He was blindfolded and escorted to the next stage of the process, and while this was underway, Nasubi expressed that he felt like he'd used up all his luck in his life. An interesting statement, considering the importance of luck in the coming months. Nasubi was brought into a small apartment, blindfold removed, and found himself face to face with the legendary Tsuchiya. Think of all the things you could experience in the moment you get to star on a TV show. Standing before you is the best dude in television as far as you're concerned. You're probably expecting a smile and a warm congratulations. In Nasubi's case, the first word he heard was strip. A shocker. Nasubi was understandably hesitant to follow that instruction. However, Tsuchiya was the sort of person who could create an unmistakable aura of intimidation. In order to avoid getting on his bad side, Nasubi obliged. Now, full nudity wasn't allowed on TV, so Nasubi had to be covered somehow for the broadcast. Of all the ways to censor Nasubi, they chose an eggplant graphic. No, at that time eggplants didn't mean what they do now, they used the figure in reference to his nickname, which is a weird coincidence. While all of this was happening, the two of them were smiling. Nasubi's was a nervous smile, while Tsuchiya had a more sinister expression, one that couldn't wait to see all of this play out. He assured Nasubi that most of the footage would never be aired, a lie. Nonetheless, the naive Nasubi stopped paying attention to the camera as much as possible. Of course, no contracts were signed, so Tsuchiya's false promises wouldn't backfire on the Denpa Shonen in the future. Now what? It's time for a life and prizes to begin. Nasubi was given a few rules. For one, this game would revolve around pure luck and magazine sweepstakes. Next, he had to send in his name and an address on a postcard to the magazine publishers for a chance to win. Each offered a variety of random prizes, and the only way to complete the game was to collect 1 million yen in total winnings. At the time, that was about 8,000 United States dollars. What did Nasubi have at his disposal to start with? Well, there was a table in the room, an air conditioner, a radio, a floor cushion, a ballpoint pen, stacks of postcards, and rows of new magazines. The apartment also had a bathroom, shower, sink, and a gas top stove. No cooking utensils, unfortunately. It was almost like starting out at level 1 in a video game, but unlike video games, there was no randomness tuned in his favor. Instead, Nasubi relied on pure luck, and as you'll come to learn, a bit of manipulation against his luck. It was a completely lonesome experience for the young comic. Right next door to him, the Denpa Shonen production team rented a room to act as their on-site headquarters. So while Nasubi was alone, a group of staff was on standby, ready to fulfill any demands from producers. Many boundaries were crossed during the filming, starting almost immediately. To film him waking up every morning, an assistant snuck into Nasubi's room while he slept to hit record on a camera. They also had to change the batteries and make adjustments to ensure the footage was clear. Every single week, the team got 24/7 video of Nasubi, and they were able to edit it all down to 6 minutes for the show. At one point, people began to doubt the legitimacy of what they were seeing, so Tsuchiya decided to set up an endless livestream for anyone to watch on their website. A team worked around the clock to censor Nasubi's privates during the entire ordeal. Nasubi's diary was another element of the experience that made things more depressing. In order to provide viewers a glimpse into his state of mind, Nasubi was given a diary. Most of the entries were thoughts of food, some detailed the feelings of sadness towards his poor luck. There were also heartbreaking entries of Nasubi thinking of the outside world and his family. He even expressed guilt for disobeying the no nudity rule his parents asked him to follow. A life in prizes skyrocketed in popularity, and the press eventually got wind of the filming location. Nasubi was transported to a similar apartment in a new undisclosed location. He stayed in this location for about 3 months, but it seemed like his prize-winning luck ran out after a while. His food supply was also running out, so the producers moved him again for a third time. This turned out to be the charm, as Nasubi actually won more often in apartment 3. A life in prizes offered a simple premise, but underneath the straightforward rules, there were many layers of mental entrapment that forced Nasubi to live in those conditions. First and most glaring of all is the lure of prizes. Sure, 1 million yen is the ultimate goal, but for Nasubi, his basic human needs were the immediate priority. He had to get started with the postcards as soon as he possibly could. In signing postcards, Nasubi felt a sense of purpose and routine. To understand why the postcards were so important, consider college life. Even if you don't enjoy it, you know you have to wake up early, attend classes, do homework, and prepare for exams. After 3 straight months of enduring school routines, you get back home. What happens then? In the first week, you're probably waking up super early. You might even start to feel empty and even uncomfortable with so much free time. A similar thing existed with Nasubi. Thanks to his routine, the bizarre nature of those living conditions weren't the primary focus. Instead of enduring the mental anguish of loneliness, he quickly learned to get with the program and follow a pattern. In psychology, this concept is known as a habit loop, and typically a habit loop consists of 4 elements. First is a cue. This is the trigger for a behavior. In Nasubi's case, the isolation and lack of activity except for postcards made for a strong start. Next is the craving, and this is a desire or motivation driving one's behavior. With Nasubi, necessities and a sense of progress drove him to start working on the postcards. Third is a routine, a behavior or an action that is carried out repeatedly. Nasubi has to survive, prompting his need to enter sweepstakes daily. Finally, there's a reward. In a habit loop, it's the satisfaction gained from the behavior. Winning items for comfort, entertainment, and survival were the ultimate rewards to Nasubi. He was eventually able to complete 200 to 300 postcards in a single day. This created a solid sense of purpose with each new day. Remember, he was also on a comedy show and he had a natural urge to perform and avoid being boring. Crazy antics, smiles, and funny expressions helped him cope a little bit better. The nature of the show was one that relied on Nasubi receiving prizes sporadically. There was nothing predictable about what type of prize would show up. With each win, Nasubi stood a chance to receive rewards that would reinforce his behavior, further maintaining his engagement despite the challenging conditions. In psychology, there's a concept known as intermittent reinforcement, and it plays a huge role in getting someone to become persistent. With unpredictable rewards, it's easier to keep an individual motivated enough to continue with a behavior. Nowadays, one of the biggest forms of intermittent reinforcement exists in gambling. The randomness of wins is exciting, and winning big feels like a well-earned accomplishment. While others may need to put in hours of hard work for the same financial gain, the idea that you can simply hit a jackpot or get all of the right cards at the blackjack table seems appealing. With the intermittent reinforcement established, it can be hard to break the habit. Unpredictability is inherently stressful, so it can lead to frustration and anxiety. Also, once those behaviors are established, it can be difficult to extinguish them after. Surviving on crackers, rice, and even dog food was pretty grueling. After 335 days of pure isolation, Nasubi won a set of car tires and finally reached the target: 1 million yen in total prize winnings. In the mode of celebration, as you might expect by now, something cruel. In the middle of the night, Tsushiya and a camera crew came into Nasubi's room with a flashlight, shining it directly on his face while popping confetti. The loud noise was terrifying, and Nasubi woke up groggily. Remember, the prize routine had been his life for so long, the idea of winning wasn't even close to the front of his mind. It took a few minutes before Nasubi was able to figure out that this was his celebratory moment. At that point, an interesting change in Nasubi was clear. With little to no human interaction for the past year, there was an unnatural detachment in his interactions. Compared to his old self, this Nasubi felt like his smiles were forced and his expressions were lost. Nevertheless, Tsushiya pushed on with the proceedings. The team planned to celebrate with Nasubi, so it was back to the blindfold once more. This time around, they drove him all the way to a dock, then proceeded to secretly transport him to South Korea with a ferry. Upon arriving in South Korea, Nasubi had a little vacation. He was taken to a barbecue spot because he fantasized about it in his diary, and he also enjoyed some time in an amusement park. All things considered, it was a wholesome experience from what was portrayed. Once the celebrations were over, Nasubi was handed a jar of kimchi, given a blindfold, and driven to the next location. When his blindfold was removed, everything looked familiar. The drama was happening all over again, just like before. How was this possible, and how could anyone ever expect Nasubi to agree to this? For Tsushiya, it was a bold move, one that he had planned for a long time. The entire vacation was created to bring Nasubi's spirits up, only to crush them in the name of entertainment. Still, it's strange that he felt confident in convincing Nasubi to stay. It takes a dangerous level of psychological manipulation to execute this sort of plan. As far as Tsushiya was concerned, at that point, Nasubi would be willing to do anything. Tsushiya's methods echoed those used by some of the world's most notorious cult leaders and controversial figures. Just like them, he exploited Nasubi's psychological vulnerabilities. Right from childhood, Nasubi had been the type of person who sought approval from his peers, even willing to accept a cruel name. This isn't inherently a bad thing, but in the hands of a person like Tsushiya, a young man like Nasubi was easy pickings. It's not impossible to imagine that Nasubi never fully acknowledged the gravity of his circumstances. As you'll come to learn, there are ways to prevent someone from leaving, even if the door is wide open. The best way to keep a prisoner from escaping is to make sure he never knows he's in prison. One trait that Nasubi possessed was that Tsushiya took notice of what was his subservience. Subservience is an interesting concept to think about, especially when applied to Nasubi's situation. For psychologists, this involves understanding how and why individuals become willing to submit to an authority or dominant figure. Considering that Nasubi was aspiring towards a goal of becoming a successful comic, it's not hard to draw the lines between him and Tsushiya. Tsushiya was at the peak of the business of comedy. Running one of the biggest shows on the planet, this figure seemed like the one guy in Tokyo who had the secret recipes for Nasubi. If Nasubi wanted to find success, he had to learn from him and stick to his plans. Besides, Tsushiya was also someone that people respected. As far as someone in Nasubi's position was concerned, he was a vessel for a bigger dream. For the most part, Tsuchiya was Nasubi's only source of human interaction, and because of this he could fully influence Nasubi enough to ensure he continued believing he was exactly where he belonged. Gaslighting is when one person seeks to make another person doubt their own perceptions, memories, or sanity. Every word that came out of Tsuchiya's mouth came across as absolute facts. Even when Nasubi attempted to protest, he was made to feel dumb for not understanding. Any attempt to deviate from what was expected on the show was made to look like Nasubi was disappointing the audience. On top of that, the occasional change in locations was literally a form of reality distortion that kicked Nasubi out of a strong sense of continuity. Fully deprived of social contact outside of the reality created for a life in prizes, Nasubi's world essentially shrank into the confines of his room. Think about the early days of the COVID pandemic. People were suddenly cut off from their routines, social interactions, and support networks. People were forced into profound isolation at home for extended periods. This isolation led to feelings of loneliness and anxiety, the likes of which many had never experienced before. Long-term isolation can have lasting effects, and some people feel like they'll never be able to return to their old selves after that experience. Compared to the pandemic, Nasubi's isolation was much more extreme. It lasted for over a year and existed solely for the purpose of entertaining the masses. That layer of having no real point to the resulting pain made things much worse. Once a life in prizes began, Tsuchiya understood the importance of denying Nasubi any basic necessities and comfort. By creating a notion that Nasubi's only path forward was in his compliance, it was easier to convince him to keep the show going. There were also intermittent moments of comfort. The barbecue and amusement park visits felt like kind gestures to Nasubi. Ultimately, this likely made Nasubi feel a deeper sense of gratitude towards Tsuchiya, as if he owed him something to acknowledge his kindness. The techniques used by Tsuchiya over the course of the show are reminiscent of society's most despicable individuals. While Tsuchiya didn't set off to physically harm anyone, his choice of approach was still despicable. One figure who comes to mind is Jim Jones. Jones was an authoritative American cult leader who used psychological manipulation to control his followers and lead them to extreme actions, ending with mass suicide in 1978. Although obviously not as extreme, Tsuchiya was able to use his position to manipulate Nasubi's environment and mental state, successfully pushing him to his limits. Another person who possesses similarities to Tsuchiya when it comes to the mastering of psychological manipulation is Charles Manson. During the 1960s, Manson presented himself as Jesus, or the devil, to his followers. He would also isolate them from mainstream society, making them fully dependent on him for survival, and using this control to convince them to commit murder. This technique was also something that Tsuchiya used. Not even Nasubi's parents were able to reach him while he was on the show. I could have escaped if I really wanted to. Psychologically, you feel that rather than escaping or doing something radical, staying put and not causing trouble is the safest option. In a stroke of coincidence, The Truman Show starring Jim Carrey was released in 1998, the same year Nasubi faced his ordeal on a life of prizes. The Truman Show centers on Truman Burbank's entire life, which is televised to an audience, and orchestrated by the show's creator, Christoph. In every aspect of his environment, from the weather to his interactions with others, it's all carefully planned, designed to maintain the illusion of reality. Similarly, Nasubi's life was in the hands of Tsuchiya. His entire sense of reality was curated for the most entertainment value possible. Food and necessities were gamified, and audiences were excited to see his reactions to winning access to these necessities. The role of both programs' creators is what made this connection even more surreal. With The Truman Show, there's an understanding that this movie is supposed to be a cautionary tale at the dawn of the digital age. Meanwhile, there was a real person in Japan who already saw years ahead into the future of entertainment. Christoph and Tsuchiya played a godlike role in each of their victims' lives, and they all had the power to orchestrate events designed to draw out specific reactions. In Tsuchiya's words, "I wanted to film an aspect of humanity that only I can capture." Considering the gravity of both subjects' situations, it's peculiar that Truman and Nasubi never actually got angry. Sure, there was some resentment, but it's also likely that the psychological conditioning that took place made them more docile. It's almost like being stripped of regular emotions. Instead of being a person, you're like a machine. In Truman's case, he wasn't isolated, but everyone around him was an actor. He understandably got frustrated when he eventually discovered this. but his anger wasn't something he was familiar with. On the other hand, Nasubi was more focused on the end goal, so much so that his real life wasn't as much of a priority to chase. It's no surprise since manipulation is a dangerous act that can scramble a victim's emotional state horribly. So the burning question in the mind of every reasonable person is, why did they let this happen? From the moment Nasubi was dumped into that tiny apartment, he became a character for the audience, with hosts making regular commentary on the situation. They'd make funny jokes and include gags and other antics that kept things interesting. Still, the trivialization of Nasubi's situation had to have appeared concerning after a while. Tsushiya's goal was to showcase something that had never been seen on television was a success. There was no precedent of anything like this before. Even if there were people concerned, it was hard to find the right sources to contact and shut down production. Media outlets outside of Japan voiced some concern, as did Nasubi's family, but contacting Tsushiya was near impossible. As outside spectators, viewers became passive participants in the show. With so many people watching, everyone assumed that somebody else would intervene if things got further out of control. Ultimately, this lack of responsibility contributed to normalizing Nasubi's suffering, providing a disturbing example of the bystander effect. With all your friends and co-workers talking about a life and prizes so casually, the spectacle of it all quickly overshadows the cold hard truth of the situation. While factors like the bystander effect definitely contributed to the lack of action to end the cruelty directed at Nasubi, some other elements might have fueled viewers' apathy and even drawn them to the show. Schadenfreude. This is a German term that refers to the pleasure people gain from witnessing someone else's misfortune. For many viewers, they probably lived vicariously through Nasubi's misfortune, experiencing the extremes of human endurance from the comfort of their homes. Escapism. It's not far-fetched to imagine that some of the audience saw this as a chance to forget their own problems. It was like a stark contrast to their everyday lives. The dramatic nature of Nasubi's challenges offered some solace, along the lines of, "At least I'm not that guy." A Life in Prizes provides a compelling case study of how control is exercised in the real world. Although it now seems easy to categorize this show as a one-off fluke, there's a strong connection between it and our own societal structures. A Life in Prizes draws many parallels to George Orwell's 1984, a dystopian novel that centers on a world where the government exerts full control over its citizens through constant surveillance and manipulation. In Orwell's fictional world, individuals are constantly watched, and their behaviors are dictated by an omnipresent authority. For Nasubi, his autonomy was fully stripped, and the narrative of his life was transformed, all for the amusement of others. In the real world, political mechanisms exist in subtle but pervasive ways. Censorship, propaganda, and surveillance are key components for some governments' manipulation of information and shaping of people's perceptions. The way Tsushiya shaped Nasubi's reality mirrors the tactics their citizens are exposed to on a daily basis. The use of economic systems is also prevalent for control over individuals. In A Life in Prizes, the idea of winning something, anything, was presented to keep Nasubi pacified and ensure he took pride in material success. Even at the cost of his own freedom, he remained in those terrible conditions. Today we're bombarded with the existence of a consumer culture, excessive pursuit of material wealth, and a strong push from advertisers to get things we don't need. The consequence of this is more societal pressure focused on material possessions, creating a cycle of consumption that dominates our lives. And this begs the question, are humans just puppets in somebody else's game, and is it possible to break away from what is controlling us? Well, we can take a look at Nasubi's life today for some answers. 15 total months of existing with no autonomy and being isolated from humanity. Nasubi eventually ended his run on Denpa Shonen with a live show in front of an audience. Naturally, most of this was a blur to him. Following Denpa Shonen, Nasubi reunited with his family, made guest appearances on other shows, and became a sort of unlikely celebrity. Yet that glimmer in him didn't seem to show up anymore. His comedic senses dulled, and he struggled to keep up with the level of fame that came with Denpa Shonen. He was eventually featured on some television shows in support roles, but that was the extent of his success. However, all of that would change. On March 11, 2011, a tsunami caused by a magnitude 9.1 earthquake struck Japan. It was a devastating event that resulted in the deaths of 20,000 people. The effects were particularly strong in Nasubi's home of Fukushima. Without a strong support network in place for the city, Nasubi decided to step up and help the people. Thanks to his popularity, his presence during the recovery efforts and numerous fundraisers helped put a smile on people's faces. Nasubi then decided to do something big to inspire the people of Fukushima. He took on the challenge of climbing Mount Everest. As no stranger to adversity, Nasubi made 3 unsuccessful attempts between 2013 and 2015. Finally, in 2016, the man who survived extreme living conditions that would crush most other people reached the peak of Earth's highest mountain, a true testament of the indomitable human spirit in the face of adversity. Today, Nasubi stays active in his community, giving talks and working with charity organizations. After surviving a harrowing scenario, Nasubi's legacy inspires us to look towards resilience and humanity's capacity to find hope and meaning in challenging circumstances. While history has shown humans can be manipulated quite easily, it has also demonstrated examples of people breaking away from labels and exceeding expectations. It's a struggle, but climbing those mountains provides a level of resilience that allows us to understand ourselves even more. Nasubi's is a story of pain for some, but it also highlights the potential for humans to overcome horrendous situations and turn negatives into positives. Hey there. Because you watched until this point, I have a gift for you. For the past few months, we've been working on a documentary about how Stoicism has turned from an ancient and sacred philosophy into the world's greatest scam, thanks to the manosphere and people like Andrew Tate. The feature-length documentary took a lot of time and effort to produce, and we're very happy to bring it to you guys. It'll be premiering live on this channel on the 7th of September 2024. If you want to dive a little deeper, paid members on our Patreon will get early access to the video, ad-free, as well as a director's commentary and a conversation with the team behind the video after it airs. If you'd like to subscribe to our Patreon, click the link in the description down below. As always, there is no obligation for it. Your likes, shares, and comments already make a lot of a difference. We really appreciate all the support. Thank you, and we can't wait to share and watch what we've made with all of you.